Assalamu alaikum. Today, inshallah, we are going to continue our topic about the economic growth. As you said, we are talking this chapter about the part one of the economic growth, the capital accumulation and population growth affects the economic growth. And in the next chapter, we will see how the technology affects the economic growth. We already started this chapter. We saw the solo model in the closed economy and how the country's standard of living depends on its saving. And we will see now how it also depends on the population growth rates, and we will continue about the golden rule to find the optimal saving rate and capital stock. So let's remember together what we did last lesson. We saw some rates about the income, international differences in the standard of living to show why the economic growth or the growth of the economy of any country is important, because it affects the standard of living of the people and the families in this country. As we see, we talk about the United States is $51,000 per person every year, the average income. Another country like Ethiopia, it's only $1,200 per year at income per person. So there's a big difference. So how the economic growth affects the standard of living of our life. This is why it is important and why we study the economic growth and how to see that affects the to study this, we saw about the solo model, which is used widely for the governments and policymakers to increase the rate of the economic growth. And it is, as we saw, it is designed to show how the growth in the capital stock, growth in labor, and advances in technology interact together in any economy to as how they affect the nation's total output of goods and services. And when the total output increased, so the income increase, the standard of living increase. So it's all about the capital stock and the labor force and the technology. Okay. Um, let's we study all this. We saw also the relation between the investments and the depreciation here. Okay, as we can see, as we saw, the value of the capital per worker and the amount of output is determined by the production function, and the allocation of the output between consumption and investment is determined by the saving. Okay. We saw also the steady state of capital and the relation between the investment and the depreciation. So this model, as we saw, predicts that countries that have higher rates of saving, countries that have higher rates of saving and investment will have higher levels of capital and income per worker in the long run. And we saw how this theory is right. This is the prediction first, as we can see here, the increase in the saving rate raises the investment, that shows that cause the capital stock to grow towards a new steady state. So there will be more output and then more income and so on. We saw also how the high investment in the horizontal axis, when the investment increase, to the right, is associated with high income per person in the vertical axis to the above. So as the solo model predicts, we can see the positive relationship between the investment increase and the income per person increasing. Okay, now we will start our second topic about the golden rule. The golden rule so far. Now we have used the solo model to examine how and the economy's rate of saving and investment determine its steady state levels of capital and income. Okay, how? So you have now income, you consume or spend some of this income and save some. This saved is invested. Okay, how much you save and how much you invest. Okay, determines how much capital you have, and how much capital you have will determine how much output you will have, and this output will determine how much income you will have, and so on. So how this your standard of living will change. So this analysis might lead to think that higher saving is always a good thing because it always leads to a greater income. Yet suppose a nation has a saving rate of 100%. يعني they save all their income. That would lead to the largest possible capital stock, okay, and the largest possible income. But if all of this income is saved and none is ever consumed, what good is it? If this country saved 100% of their income, so there is no consumption. Is this good or not? So now we will see the golden rule. Different values of savings lead to different steady states, right? How do we know which is the best steady state? The best steady state has the highest possible consumption per person. Okay, now we are going to the golden. The best steady state that we will find according to the value of our savings. The best one is the one that have the highest possible consumption per person. Okay, so an increase in the savings lead to higher steady state of capital and steady state of output, which raises the steady state of the consumption. So reduces consumption's share of income by one, or the total, minus the savings, which lowers the steady state of the consumption. So how do we find the savings and the steady state that maximizes the consumption steady state? Here is the golden rule level of capital. Steady state value of K that maximizes the consumption. This is the golden rule. The steady state value of K that maximizes the consumption. To find it, first express the steady state of consumption in terms of steady state of capital, and it equals the steady state of output minus the investment. So in the steady state, in this case, the investment steady state equals the depreciation, the rate of depreciation of the steady state of capital, because the change here in the capital equals 0 or no change. So in this graph, the steady state of capital and the rate of depreciation of capital look for the point where the gap between them is biggest. This point, okay, which is the gold one. The point where the gap between them is a biggest. You can see the steady state capital per worker and the steady state output and depreciation. Okay, so this difference is the consumption steady state that a maximize. So consumption steady state here is the biggest where the slope of the production function, which is this curvy one, equals the slope of the depreciation line, which is a straight one. Mhm. So the MPK here, or the marginal product of capital, equals the rate of depreciation. To get it short, so we can see here, below the golden rule, you can see here the golden rule, the point at the highest gap. Below the golden rule, in the left, steady state increases in steady state capital, raises steady state consumption. Okay, when the steady state capital increase, that raises the steady state consumption. After or above the golden rule steady state, increases in steady state capital reduce the steady state consumption in these. So the economy's output is used for consumption or investment. As we know, we have output or have income, so we may consume it or invest it. In the steady state, investment equals depreciation. In the steady state, as we know, the investment equal depreciation in this case. So steady state consumption is the difference between the output and the depreciation rate. At the steady state consumption is maximized at the golden rule steady state, and the golden rule capital stock is denoted as we see K star gold, and the golden rule level of consumption is denoted C star gold. So here you can see the saving rate and the golden rule. You can see the relation. To reach the golden rule steady state here as we know it, and then the economy needs the right saving rate. How much I have to save to reach this golden rule. Okay, we can see in the horizontal axis the steady state capital per worker, and in the vertical the steady state input or depreciation and investment per worker. So the saving rate and the golden rule, we need to know. There is only one saving rate that produces the golden rule level of capital. Any change in the saving rate would shift the investment curve and would move the economy to a steady state with lower level of consumption. So the transition to the golden rule steady state, the economy doesn't have a tendency to move toward the golden rule steady state, achieving the golden rule requirements. The policymakers adjust the saving to achieve the golden rule requires. The policymakers, the government, and so on adjust or change the saving rate. This adjustment leads to a new steady state with higher consumption. So, but what happens to the consumption during the transition to the golden rule? There is a gap, period between these two actions. So remember, the policymakers can affect the national saving rate, yes, by changing the government spending or the taxes affects the national saving. Also holding the tax constant overall, but changing the structure of the tax system to provide more incentives for private saving, revenue neutral shift from income tax to consumption tax, and so on. So this is how policymakers can affect the national saving. Starting by too much capital, and we will see also too little. From this point, you can see if the steady state is more than the golden rule, then the increasing the steady state of consumption requires a fall in savings. To increase the consumption, I have to decrease the saving. So in the transition to the golden rule, consumption is higher at all points in time. Okay, so we can see again consumption is increasing and investment decreasing. So this is our new. So to explain this graph, we can see here T0 here in the horizontal axis. Time is a time period in which the saving rate is reduced. Before this T0 in steady state where K, Y, C or capital, output, consumption and investment are all constant before the T as we see. At the point of T0, the change in saving rate doesn't immediately change the capital. So the output doesn't change immediately. But the fall in the savings causes a fall in the investment because saving equals investment, and a rise in the consumption has fallen, but Y or the output has not yet changed. So after the T0 here in the previous state, saving and investments were just enough to cover depreciation. Then saving and investment were reduced, so depreciation is greater than investment, which causes capital to fall toward a new lower steady state value. As the capital falls and settles on its new lower steady state value, so will output, consumption, and investment because each of them is a function of the capital. So even though consumption is falling, it doesn't fall all the way back to its initial value. So policymakers would be happy to make this change as it produces higher consumption at all points in time relative to what consumption would have been if the saving rate and not been reduced. So to get it short, okay, you can see here when the saving rate reduced and the consumption increased, this figure shows what happens over time to output, consumption, and investment when the economy begins with more capital than the golden rule level and the saving rate is reduced, and the reduction in the saving rate at time t0 causes an immediate increase in consumption and equal decrease in investment. Over time, as the capital stock falls, output, consumption, and investment fall together because the economy began with too much capital. The new steady state has a higher level of consumption than the initial steady state. So what happened when starting with too little capital? You can see here when the steady state of capital is less than the golden rule, then increasing the consumption requires an increase in savings. Future generations enjoy higher consumption, but the current one experience an initial drop in consumption. This is when you start with too little capital. So here the investment, the consumption increase and the uh, savings increase. How can we see this before the time t0 in a steady state where also capital, output, consumption, and investment are all constant? At t0, the increase in S or saving or investment doesn't immediately change the capital. Okay, so Y or the output doesn't change immediately. But the increase in saving causes investment to rise because higher saving means higher investment, and we know, and consumption to fall also because we are saving more of our income and consuming less to it. But after T0 now, saving and investment exceeds the depreciation. So the capital starts rising toward a new, higher steady state value. The behavior of capital causes the same behavior in output, consumption, and investment. So ultimately, consumption ends up at a higher steady state level, but initially consumption falls. Now, so therefore, if policymakers value the current generation's well-being more than that for future generations, they might be reluctant to adjust the saving rate to achieve the golden rule. Notice, though, that if they did increase the saving rate, an infinite number of future generations would benefit, which makes the sacrifice of the current generation seem more acceptable. Okay, so now we finished this the golden rule. The last part of our chapter is the population growth and how the population growth affects the economic growth, which is very important. So the basic solo model shows that capital accumulation by itself cannot explain sustained economic growth, as high rates of saving leads to high growth temporarily. But the economy eventually approaches a steady state in which capital and output are constant. So to explain the sustained economic growth that we observe in most parts of the world, we must expand the solo model to incorporate the other two sources of economic growth, which are the population growth and the technological progress. As we said, we will see now the population growth, and in the next chapter, we will see the technological progress and how it affects the economic growth. So, when we talk about the population growth, instead of assuming that the population is fixed as before, now we now suppose that the population and the labor force grow at a constant rate, which is n, small n. For example, the United States population grows up 1% per year. So, n here, 1%. This means that if 150 million people are working 1 year, then next year they will be 151.5 million are working next year, and so on. So again, assume that the population and the labor force grow at rate n, which is n here is exogenous. So the change in labor divided by the total labor equals n. So example, suppose L here is 1000 in year 1, and the population is growing at 2% per year, so N equals 0.02. So then the change in labor equals NL, which is 0.02 multiplied by 1000. So the N, or the change in labor, will be 20. So L will be equal 1000.20 in the next year. So the break-even investments. Now, you can see here the break-even investment, the amount of investment necessary to keep K constant, or the capital per worker constant, the amount of capital per worker. Okay, you can see here the rate of depreciation plus the rate of population growth multiplied by the capital per worker. So this is the break-even investment, the amount of investment necessary to keep the capital per worker constant. So it includes that the rate of depreciation of the capital of worker to replace capital as it wears out, and the N, or the rate of population growth per capital to equip new workers with capital. So otherwise, the capital per worker would fall as the existing capital stock would be spread more thinly over a larger population of workers, right? So the equation of motion for the capital per worker with population growth, the equation motion of capital is the, we can see the change in the capital equals the investment, or the actual investment, minus the break-even investment that we need to know. So we can see here at the solo model diagram, the investment, break-even investment, the vertical axis, and the capital per worker in the horizontal. So we can see here the steady state as we know. So the population growth in the solo model here, depreciation and population growth are two reasons the capital stock per worker shrinks. How? If the N, or the rate of population, is the rate of population growth and the rate of depreciation, then the break-even investment, as we said, the amount of investment necessary to keep constant the capital stock per worker for the economy to be in a steady state. The investment must offset the effects of depreciation and the population growth. This is represented by the crossing of these two curves here. When the investment offset the effects of the depreciation and the population growth. So we can see the impact of the population growth here, which alters the basic solar model in three ways. First, it brings us closer to explaining sustained economic growth in the steady state with population growth, capital per worker, and output per worker are constant. Second, population growth gives us another explanation for why some countries are rich and others are poor. Finally, the population growth affects our criterion for determining the golden rule consumption maximizing level of capital. We can see these impacts here in this graph as an increase in N or in the rate of population growth causes an increase in the break-even investment, as we can see here. This leads to a lower steady state of capital. As we will now, you will see the new steady state, the lower steady state. So again, an increase in the population rate cause an increase in the break-even investment, which leads to lower steady state level of capital. So we can see again an increase in the rate of population growth reduces the steady state capital as an increase in the rate of population growth from N1 to N2. This graph shifts the line representing the population growth and depreciation upwards. So the new steady state, K star 2, has a lower level of capital per worker than the initial steady state, K star 1. Thus, the Solo model predicts that economies with higher rates of population growth will have lower levels of capital per worker and therefore lower incomes. So this is the prediction as we just say. So when the higher we have higher N, we will have lower steady state of capital per worker. And we can see the proof of this prediction, the international evidence on population growth and income per person. You can see the negative relationship here at this figure. The scatter plots of data from about 100 countries here shows that countries with high rates of population growth tends to have low levels of income per person, as the Solo model predicts. As the can see, the correlation between these variables is very positive, is a negative, which is 0.74. Finally, you can see the golden rule with the population growth. To find the golden rule, capital stock express the consumption steady state in the terms of the capital per worker steady state. So the consumption is maximized when the marginal product capital equals the rate of depreciation plus the rate of population growth. So in the golden rule steady state here, the N or the population growth, the marginal product of capital net of the depreciation equals the population growth uh, rate. Then we have, after we saw these variables and this solo model, we can see here or in the text box some alternative perspectives of the population rates. Other scientists or other economists here have some thoughts or alternative perspectives. You can read them, take an idea about them. So finally, we saw in this chapter the solo growth model shows that the long run, a country's standard of living depends on positively on its saving rate, negatively on its population growth rate. An increase in the saving rate leads to higher output in the long run, faster growth temporarily, but not faster steady state growth. If the economy has more capital than the golden rule level, then reducing saving will increase consumption at all points in time, making all generations better off. If the economy has less capital than the golden rule level, then increasing saving will increase consumption for future generation, but reduce consumption for the present generation. Okay, so this is our chapter about the part one of the economic growth, the capital accumulation and population growth. See you next lesson, inshallah, in the second part about the economic growth and the effects of technology. Goodbye.